Hey, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour, and in this video, I want to talk about a super ancient, super complicated, super legendary, super influential translation of the ancient Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Now, this thing, or collection of things, is called the Septuagint. And like I said, it's a complicated topic. Now, I see what you're doing, and I don't blame you. You kind of glance down to the side there and you're like, oh, what else you got for me, YouTube? You have anything that's maybe a little more fun than talking about this super ancient Bible translation? And the answer is no. No, YouTube doesn't have anything more interesting than this because this is the most interesting thing of all the things. Okay, maybe not the most interesting, but it's right up there at the top. And what I'd like to try to do right now, while we still have a few minutes of this introduction, is to try to sell you on this concept. So think of it like this. World War I, you've heard of it. This is the war to end all wars. This is the war that broke the brain of the West and changed everything. But before World War I, we probably saw the highest point in all of human history in terms of optimism about ourselves as humans and where this whole thing is going and how technology can help us tame the world and make it better, about human nobility and virtue and doing the right thing and the trustworthiness of your neighbor. And a lot of that had to do with, of course, scientific progress and the Enlightenment, the expansion of the mind and the Western liberalism and freedom, but also it had a lot to do with what people were reading. Now, there was a book that was published in 1896 called The Well at the World's End. It was written by a guy named William Morris, and William Morris put together this far-reaching fantasy tale that kind of feels medievalish in nature about these four brothers, one in particular named Ralph, the son of King Peter, who goes off on this great big adventure and encounters all of these things that would become the archetypes for all the video games you play, all of the fantasy literature that you read. And in his journey, this young man develops a sense of, again, nobility and honesty and integrity, and those virtues benefit him as he goes on these adventures. And let me tell you who read it. Pretty much every single young man who volunteered to go and fight in those trenches in World War I. And the reason that some people, most notably a guy named Paul Fussell, who wrote one of the best history books ever, The Great War and Modern Memory, the reason that some real smart people think that these young men went and signed up so enthusiastically for this war is that they imagined themselves to be Ralph. They imagined themselves to be on a noble crusade to go and fight for the hand of the fair maiden. And it makes it sound like these kids were dumb. They weren't dumb. They were just influenced by story, like all of us are. Well, two of the kids that got influenced by that story and found themselves in that environment were C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And both of them were so influenced by this book that they borrowed names and imagery. One of the horses is like Shadow Fox or Silver Fax or something like that. King Gandalf is one of the characters. There's a stone table that factors prominently into it. I already told you there was a guy named King Peter. If you know anything about these guys' writing, you know it shaped them. And likewise, it shaped every guy who fought in that war who you've never heard of. Now, sadly, they went into those trenches with that sense of optimism, and those who came out lost that sense of optimism, and something really changed in that moment. But if you want to understand World War I, and you want to understand the psychology of what's going on there, you got to understand this document that most of us have never heard of that so profoundly influenced the way people think. It framed the discussion. Likewise, this super ancient translation that I'm telling you about, the Septuagint, a lot of people think that was the Bible that was in circulation, Bible in quotes, in the first century. That was the document that Jesus read growing up. That was the document that the disciples were familiar with. That was the document that the gospel writers were familiar with. That was the document that the original audience, both in front of Jesus physically and the original audience who would have read the first round of the gospels when they first got circulated, that's what they were reading. Now, we're going to talk about whether or not that's fully the case, but whatever the case, this translation was a giant deal. And if you want to understand Jesus, the disciples, the Gospels, the Bible, and early Christianity, you got to have some sense of what the Septuagint was and how it factors into those things as this profound influencer in the same way that the well at the end of the world influenced the young men who headed into those trenches. Have I sold you? Or did we just have fun telling a story? It could be both, right? All right, so let's talk about the Septuagint. I'm just going to break this up into little chunks and give you quick hitting details so you can put this in your hip pocket and do with it what you want. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Let's get after it. Like I told you a minute ago, the Septuagint, this ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, is shrouded in the mists of legend and myth, and I don't want to keep you waiting on that. So here's the story. About 150 years before the birth of Christ, there is this letter that gets written. It's called the Letter of Aristeas, and I'm going to link it down below so you can read the whole thing for yourself if you want to. It's been circulated all over the place, and we still have it from its earliest forms. This Letter of Aristeas tells this tale of a moment in history, briefly after the Alexandrian conquest, after Alexander the Great conquered the world. And you got a problem now. You have a whole bunch of Jewish people scattered around the world, particularly in Egypt, and they've all been Greekified. They don't speak Hebrew the way they used to. They speak Greek. And, well, that's a problem because the Hebrew scriptures are in Hebrew. So what are you going to do? Well, the king of Egypt commissions 72 scribes and scholars to come to Alexandria, Egypt, newly founded city, and to be locked in separate cells where they're going to translate the first 5 books of the scriptures: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And they go through this lengthy process, and according to the letter of Aristeas, which again is the only source we have on this, all 72 produce exactly the same thing. No deviation whatsoever. All the letters are identical. And if you know anything about translation, whoa, that's incredible, right? I mean, if we took 72 fluent English, Spanish speakers and locked them in separate cells and had them translate some gigantic book, not even 2 of them are going to be identical, let alone 72. If that sounds too good to be true, well, it's because it's a myth and it's legend. I don't think anybody actually thinks that's what happened, especially considering that we only have one source on that, and especially considering that the evolution of this translation really just began there and continues to grow and change and morph over time. But, like I said, it's a pretty good story. So why did this letter of Aristeas happen? Well, one of 2 reasons, I suppose. One, maybe this letter was written to get Jewish people excited about their heritage and their history at a time where there was some pretty serious revolutionary political turmoil going on amongst their people. Or maybe it was there as kind of an apologetic to the Greek-speaking world to help them see how true these Hebrew scriptures actually were. I don't know, lots of people theorize about it, but what we do know is this. These translators and future translators in Alexandria go on to translate all of what the Hebrews regarded as scriptures. But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. What was that? Well, the letter doesn't fully address it, and the evidence we have after the fact makes that a little complicated. So that legend from the letter of Aristeas is what lends the Septuagint its name. If you're reading Bible stuff or something, you come across the Roman numerals LXX. And I tried to flip that around so it would work for you. I don't know if I got that right. If you see that, it's the Roman numeral for 70, right? But it's actually super secret Bible code for Septuagint. See what they're doing? Sept, 70, like, Sept from Game of Thrones, the 7, they have the 7. See how that works? And so what they're doing there is they are alluding to the legend in describing any of these Greek translations of the Hebrew. But which translations are we talking about? And do we have the originals intact? There's so many questions to tackle, but I want to get to the one that I just raised a second ago. What's actually in the document? Well, the answer is we don't know. We can say some stuff that we're sure must have been in these Greek translations. We know Deuteronomy is in there because we actually have a few fragments in Greek from before the time of Jesus. But none of those fragments give us a table of contents. None of those fragments are like, here's everything that we put in the book because we knew this was all the stuff that we think of as Bible at this time. It looks like that concept maybe wasn't fully developed just yet. So as a result, well, I guess any Hebrew religious writing that was translated into Greek could be mistakenly lumped in with this Septuagint thing. Well, you fast forward a ways into the Christian era, and you get 3 great big expressions of the Old and New Testaments. And the Old Testament parts are all drawn from this Septuagint, this Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. And the tricky thing about these three great expressions of this, the Codex Vaticanus, that's a complete document or almost complete document that's held, not surprisingly, at the Vatican, Alexandrinus, and Codex Sinaiticus, is that these three oldest versions of the Septuagint do not agree on what books belong in there. They're spotty in this. They agree on some stuff, they disagree on others. The entire Old Testament, as you see in a Protestant Bible today or in the Hebrew Scriptures, is agreed upon. That's all in there. But some of the stuff that Protestants would call Apocrypha, or that Roman Catholics would call deuterocanonical, or the slightly different list of books that Orthodox Christians would call deuterocanonical, that stuff there doesn't seem to be agreement on. So we know what was in the Septuagint, but we don't know how far those boundaries extend. So at this point in the conversation, some of you might be like, I'm pretty sure my Uncle Harold has a copy of the Septuagint. I saw it one time looking at his bookshelves. So apparently the Septuagint is still around. This video is dumb. I am going to go watch something else. Stop! Well, there are copies of the Septuagint, but you got to understand what those are. The two big versions of the Septuagint that you can still go on Amazon and buy today are a distillation of really a very poorly attested collection of Greek Old Testament manuscripts that are cobbled together to make this thing work. This is not like the New Testament. With the New Testament, we've got almost 30,000 partial or complete manuscripts. There's just so much data to work off of. You might not believe any of the things that are written in there. I happen to. But you can't argue with the amount of data that they're drawing on to say, yeah, we got a pretty good sense of what the actual New Testament was, what books were actually in the actual New Testament. Some of that's a function of the New Testament being closer in time to us. Some of that's a function of the New Testament going beyond the boundaries of Judaism. So everybody's copying it and circulating it. And of course, that means you just got a whole lot more to go around to rebuild that with. But the Septuagint, not the same deal. You're cobbling together very limited resources. So yes, there are readable English translations of what we're calling the Septuagint floating around, but don't think of that the way you would think of the New Testament in terms of reliability. Okay, so there's a few of the nuts and bolts of how this whole thing happened. But now let's get back to the question that we were leading with, which is, how did this influence the people who were at the beginning of Christianity? How do we know that this shaped the New Testament, that this was the Bible that Jesus read or that the disciples read? Well, here are a few thoughts on that. First of all, the New Testament quotes the Old Testament about 300 times. Some of those quotes are quite literally quotes. Like, it says this and then this. Some of those quotes, though, are more paraphrases. And there are a lot of theories as to why some of it's paraphrasy and why some of it looks like a direct quote. And I think it all has to do with the long shadow being cast by the Septuagint. So the paraphrases, it's kind of hard to nail down where those came from, right? Because that could be a paraphrase of the Hebrew Scriptures. Like imagine this. Let's say Jesus is out, walking along and talking with some people, and he's teaching a group of people who are from Galilee. Well, in Galilee, they spoke Aramaic. It's like Hebrew, but not quite the same thing. And, is he going to be like, hey, here's how the things are with the thing, and, it's like the Scriptures say, and then hold on a minute, everybody, I'm going to flip this into Greek because we only do the Scriptures in Greek. No, he's not going to do that. He's either going to offer an on-the-fly paraphrase of the Hebrew Scriptures in Aramaic, or maybe everybody was so used to the rhythm of the Hebrew language when it came to the Scriptures that they would still understand that even if they didn't speak Hebrew every single day. And so then it would make sense that what we would see in the New Testament text would be a paraphrase or an allusion to that Old Testament reference. But at other points, we see direct quotes, like when Jesus goes to the synagogue and he unrolls the scroll and he reads from the prophet Isaiah. Well, what language do you think that scroll was in? I mean, it probably wasn't in Greek. These were elite Hebrew religious scholars who were going to hang out at that synagogue. He's probably reading that scroll in Hebrew, would be my guess. But the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written originally in Greek, or so it appears. There's some debate about Matthew. So then, what's Luke supposed to do when he comes to that? Is he supposed to get to that and be like, okay, here's everything in Greek, and now I'm just going to put the Bible verse in Hebrew. Well, then his audience couldn't read it. Is he supposed to get there and be like, okay, everything's in Greek, and now Jesus reads this, and I'll do a new translation from the Hebrew to the Greek? Well, that's not really his area of specialization. And why is he doing that? Or would the more natural thing to be like, Jesus is saying some stuff, and I'm recording all of it in Greek, and then he reads from this scroll, and oh, we already have a translation of that part of the Bible floating around. Later, people will come to call it the Septuagint. So I'll just plug that in because that's the part of the Bible or the version of the Bible that people would know when it comes to Greek. I think that's probably what happened. So it would make sense then that 75 to 90% of the direct scriptural quotes of the New Testament would all be drawn from this thing or this collection that we think of as the Septuagint, which makes it very, very influential on Christianity and the New Testament, and indeed the entire history of planet Earth because of the enormous influence that Christianity and the New Testament have had. So, this also creates some really interesting questions about what you do with the Bible. Because the Septuagint and the original Hebrew, do you see me buffering there a little bit? They don't always agree on everything. Maybe the meaning is the same and it corresponds, but that's a little bit lost on us. So very famous example, Matthew 1:24. This is where Matthew is saying, and so was fulfilled what was written in the prophet that, the child would be born of a virgin. I think I just butchered that verse, but that's the gist. Well, the Hebrew version of, I think that's Isaiah 7 that Matthew is quoting from, is, it does not use the word virgin the way we would use the word virgin, like a sexual virgin. It says something more like a young maiden. But the Septuagint is very decisively using the word parthenos, something like that, that means literally a sexual female virgin. Well, was the Hebrew version kind of a euphemism for a sexual female virgin, or does it mean something different? I don't know. I'm not good enough at this stuff, but what I do know is that Matthew, Christians believe under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, chose to draw on the specific verbiage of the Septuagint translation and not the original Hebrew. Interesting. Additionally, there's another passage it's in Acts. I wrote it down. Hang on a second. I don't want to get it wrong. I jotted down a note. Acts 2:27, that's where it's at. And in Acts 2:27, you've got a distinction between language that would make sense to a Hebrew audience and would make sense to a Greek audience. I'm going to read it to you. Got it. It's a quote here from Psalm, I don't even know which one it's quoting, Psalm 16, I guess. It says, because you will not abandon me to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. So in the original Hebrew, the language is, you will not abandon me to Sheol, nor let your Holy One see the pit. But in the Septuagint, it would have been, again, sorry, I had to write this down, because you will not abandon me to Hades, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. Well, Hades isn't a Hebrew term, but Luke is writing to a Greek audience. So what's he going to draw on here? The Hebrew text or the much more accessible, much more translatable Greek text? So part of the reason then that the Septuagint has such a big influence on early Christianity is because of the nature of early Christianity, because it goes beyond Judaism. It goes beyond the religious elites who probably still would have biblically functioned in Hebrew and out to everybody. And really the only common tongue that you could write in if you wanted to get this to everybody is Greek. And what do you know? In the book of Acts, as you just flip back over here, you can see that Jesus, in like the key verse of the whole thing, the whole missionary impulse of all of Christianity, he says, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses to Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. So I think the reason the Septuagint is so influential over Christianity is that it was the version of the scriptures that had the right linguistic build to accomplish the theological stuff that Jesus said, if you're a Christian, this is what I want you to go and accomplish, which is crazy and also incredibly fascinating. So you might get the impression from what I just said that I think the Septuagint is like, this is where it's at. This is how Bible ought to be forever because this is the version of the Bible that influenced the thinking of the disciples, and this is the version of the Bible that influenced the authors of the Gospels, and this is the version of the Bible that the early Christians would have carried around as the New Testament was gradually happening. And this is probably a version of the Bible that Jesus himself was aware of. So, yeah, there's a lot to be really excited about in terms of the Septuagint. It took something that was very limited for the Hebrew people only and kind of fulfilled the impulse of the commission of the Hebrew people that happened all the way back in Genesis when God said to Abraham, I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and you're going to be a blessing to all the nations. All the nations are going to be blessed through you. So Judaism was always meant to shape the whole world. But having a scriptures that were built in Hebrew, like, that's not really going to get it done because not even very many of the Jewish people still spoke Hebrew at this point. So the Septuagint, yeah, I am pretty high on it. It seems like it accomplished a very unique purpose at a very unique moment, even if there's some goofy myth and legend that ended up being built around it. It seems like it must have influenced Jesus, if Jesus is influenceable. I mean, the scriptures say that he grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men. So Jesus, he learned things in the physical human sense, it would appear at least. And he was able to hang, even at age 12, with elite religious scholars, probably debating the Hebrew scriptures. But he also was surely aware of these colloquial Greek translations that are floating around. So yeah, I am very high on it. I do think it's a really important, interesting thing. But the Septuagint's also got some problems, my friends. One of the problems with the Septuagint is something we've already covered. We don't actually know what's in it. We know some stuff that's definitely in it, but it gets hazier the more outside the center cut of what was, what were Hebrew scriptures you get. The second thing that's really tricky about it is it seems to selectively omit a bunch of messianic stuff. Most notably, Jeremiah chapter 33 is just cut in half. And the second half is where it gets into like the throne of David and messianic stuff about, that points to Jesus, or at least Christians believe that. So that gets a little bit difficult, and that's not the only example of that phenomenon. Additionally, you've got the problem of just the quality of the translation in general. Like this myth in the letter of Aristeas, look, it might have been a nice thing 150 years before the time of Jesus, but even the Jews didn't buy that because there's this enormous impulse to go and translate the Hebrew into Greek far better just a little after the time of Jesus. In fact, there are three big scholars who do a lifetime's worth of work to redo the translation. They don't feel like it was the best or the most accurate. So that's pretty problematic. And then a Christian scholar named Origen lines up 6 columns of all of these different translations in the Septuagint and looks through the thing, and we don't still have that anymore, but we get the impression that he had some pretty serious questions as to its reliability as well. And even when we look at the Septuagint in those 3 great big volumes that I described, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Sinaiticus, we see problems and disparities. Now, the reality is we don't have a single manuscript of the Septuagint in whole that matches anything that we have today. So our best guesses as to what it is today don't match anything from what it looked like back in the day. So it's sketchy. Maybe some of that is the ravages of history, or maybe some of that is that we mistakenly think of the Septuagint as being one single bound up volume. We say the Septuagint, and that makes you picture a book, right? Like there was a book that little Jesus had under his arm. Maybe it was like the Extreme Teen Septuagint, and maybe like his little friends who ran around with him who were girls, maybe they had like the magazine 17 Cosmo Girl Septuagint with quizzes in it about do boys think you're cute, and also some Bible verses in there, and maybe had some Septuagint notes in the bottom and some Septuagint maps in the back and a Septuagint concordance. But I don't think that's what it was. I am not convinced that it was ever a single block of stuff that got circulated, and I don't think there's enough evidence to say that. Instead, I think maybe a better way to think of the Septuagint is a descriptor of all of the somewhat accepted translations of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek from about the time of the Alexandrian conquest up until somewhere in the 1st century. If we think of it that way, well, then that makes sense of why they don't all match up so neatly. It makes sense of why there would be a little bit of disparity. And I guess we could be very troubled by that and say, oh, so the Septuagint was unreliable. The Bible that the first Christians used was unreliable. Well, or maybe we think of it in very modern terms and they thought of it in very different terms. Translation is an art. It's not a science. It's not a one-for-one decoding like the Cracker Jack box, decoder ring kind of thing. It's going to look different from person to person, and it's going to evolve with time as the receptor language evolves as well. I think what we see is a Septuagint that was a little bit flexible as it evolved over 300 years of language. Think about how different things sounded 300 years ago. And think about how different cursive looked 300 years ago. If you go and look at the Constitution or documents that came before that, a lot changes, and it would make sense that this common use, mysterious translation that has mysterious origins would have adapted over time as well. And that would explain why there was such an impulse to kind of codify this thing into something a little more universal and predictable after the rise of Christianity amongst Jewish people. Now, ultimately, the Septuagint is displaced in the minds of Jews, and they embrace something that's called the Masoretic text. That has an identical canon to what Protestants use and an almost identical canon to what Orthodox and Catholic Christians use, save, depending on who you talk to, 7-ish books, depending on the group. So that Masoretic text becomes something that's a product of a ton of Hebrew scholarship that catches on several centuries after Jesus. In summary, whether the Septuagint was a bound-up book that somebody could actually literally carry around or a collection of translations that people were drawing on, one way or the other, it influenced the people who made Christianity happen to the same degree, maybe even more, than the well at the world's end influenced the young men who decided they were going to sign up to be a part of World War I. And because the Septuagint was rattling around in their heads, it was the language and the rhythm of Scripture that so many of the people in the early church would have had going on. That means it's important for us to understand if we want to read this document critically, and we want to have a clear sense of how the whole Christianity thing happened. Now look, there are people today who hold certain theological positions that cause them to always say the Septuagint is a stupid dumpster, tire fire, it's dumb, it probably wasn't even real, it's bad, and anybody who believes in it is a liberal or this other part of Christianity. Look, I get it. I know that position exists. Unsurprisingly, there's another extreme where people say, no, I believe in this version of Christianity, and because of that, I also believe the Septuagint was utterly and absolutely reliable, and I maybe even believe the contents of the letter of Aristeas and all the myths and supernatural legends surrounding it. Look, if you know the story and you know what the deal is, it helps you sort through those things when you hear them a little bit more clearly, and you can learn how to take that with a grain of salt if you need to. A quick note on the way out the door. I love putting stuff like this together. This has been a blast to research and think through. I still have a ton of questions and a bunch more to learn, but I know when I see that LXX in the notes, I'm going to have a lot more clarity on what that means moving forward. And hopefully it's been beneficial for you as well. I'm going to do more projects like this on the other important incarnations of the Bible coming up. But all of this is possible. And I mean, literally all of this is possible because some of you decided to support the program at patreon.com/TMBH. And I don't know, I just feel like I run out of creative ways to tell you how thankful I am for you enabling me to do this and for helping me to take care of my family in that way as well. It really is awesome. Also, it's a free program. It's on the internet. And I'm just thankful that, that everybody's here who is here, whether you support the thing or not. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Thanks again to all of you. Let's do this again soon.